Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Restart and Recovery Planning webinar. I'm Pat Wright, the Executive Director of NJPSA. I just want to welcome you here today. Again, thank you for all the tremendous work that you've done this past year. And I know that the restart plans are weighing heavily on you all now as you begin to think about how to implement some of the guidance that has been provided. Just so you know, we continue to advocate on your behalf to work with the department and also legislators to think about what this means for school districts. We continue that conversation, and we are definitely here for you. We're going to continue to provide ongoing webinars and other opportunities for you to support you as you move through this planning process to reopening. So keep posted on the website and all the blasts that we send, and we will try to keep you informed as much as possible. The other piece to this is if there is something that you truly need and see that this is becoming a huge issue in the district, etc., please let us know, email us, tell us, call us. We'll be able to, we really want to hear from you, the things that you're struggling with so that we can support you appropriately. So with that, I want to thank our presenters today, and I want to thank Dave Nash, our Director of Legal One, for putting this together today. And I'm going to turn it over to Dave. And everybody have a wonderful long weekend and a happy 4th.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of what I know are incredibly busy schedules to be with us here today. We've got I think, a very important presentation today that I look at as the start of an ongoing dialogue with all of you about reopening. We're going to be talking today about some essential first steps in that process, and we're going to be with you throughout this process. We know that all of you need to have your reopening plans in place by early August. So we're going to be supporting you on a regular basis throughout July to give you the additional help you need to work all the way through this process. So as we get ourselves started today, let me introduce our two co-presenters. Thrilled to have with us today Dr. Wayne Yankus. Dr. Yankus is a longtime school physician, and he has been a wonderful partner with us in so much of our training and helping folks understand health issues as they come into play in our schools. Dr. Yankus has also been a past president of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and was it a high school teacher, Wayne?
High school teacher, yep.
Yes, and it was a high school teacher, so he can relate to the challenges of actually doing some of the things that we're talking about in our schools. So thank you, Wayne, as always, for being with us. And we're always thrilled to have Rebecca Gold with us. Rebecca is a retired Director of Human Resources, but not really. She's still working as an interim Director of Human Resources, and has been just an incredible partner with us in all of our webinars, on our online training, and our affirmative action training and human resource training, you name it. So Rebecca, thank you as always for being with us.
A pleasure, thank you.
So what I'm going to do at this point is turn off my webcam. There we go. And you should do that too, Rebecca, and we'll dive in. So as we get ourselves started, of course, many of you have heard this before. We're going to ask you, please type in your questions as we go. We obviously have a large number of participants, but we will capture all of these questions and they will inform our thinking, and we'll respond to as many as we can during our presentation today. So please type in your questions as we go. Of course, we're not giving legal advice on handling any particular issue within your district, but we can. So we encourage you to do that. So this is our plan for today. We're going to walk through the reopening guidance that just came out this past Friday, and I know we're all digesting it right now. We're going to walk through next steps for you to consider. As we do that, there are some other issues that we do have to think through. Special education has some unique challenges, so we'll touch on some of those issues as well. While we're dealing with this global pandemic, we also have issues of racial justice in our schools, and those issues still have to be in our minds as we're thinking about reopening. So just some brief guidance on how we think about reopening while preparing for that issue as well. And some related legal updates that all come back to reopening our schools. So the guidance itself, I do want to, as we get started, let me point out that you do have the ability, as we're doing this presentation, to download the PowerPoint. It is one of the links that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. We're also going to be sending out today's presentation 24 hours from now to all of you. So you're all going to get the recording, and we'll also be sending the recording to any of your colleagues who may have registered but were unable to participate in the webinar live. So everyone who's registered will get the recording and the PowerPoint for today. We give you here an embedded link in the PowerPoint to the reopening guidance. My guess is that you've all been delving through it already. 104 pages, and it's not the easiest read, but we're going to walk through it. Every district we know has to submit a reopening plan no less than 4 weeks prior to reopening. And we didn't know that before the guidance came out. We didn't know that would be the timeline. So essentially, we're talking about districts having plans ready to submit to the Department of Education by very early August. So we're going to help you with that process. The document has a couple of key phrases in there. One is anticipated minimum standards. That language, might sound like, boy, we're not quite sure, do we have to do this or not? The Department of Education and the governor are essentially saying that these are the requirements, the minimum requirements that we're going to have to meet. It's called anticipated because we know that conditions could change, as we're seeing in other parts of the country. So conditions could change between now and the start of the school year. But at this time, these are the requirements that we must meet. The document also includes many areas where there are additional considerations, and we're going to walk through some of those with you as well. Some of those are best practices. Some of those are just practical issues that we should be thinking through. This guidance coming out from the department will require a number of new policies to be adopted by school districts. So we'll identify some of those areas, and beyond the policies, many areas where there will be new protocols that we have to implement. It does require certain structures to be set up to help with the planning process and the implementation process. So you will have a restart committee district-wide, and every school will have a pandemic response team. And the guidance suggests that every school have a contact tracing liaison. So we'll talk about each of those. As we get ourselves started, of course, everything comes back to our overarching duty of care. And we know that our number one responsibility is to do everything possible to ensure the safety of our students and everybody else involved in the school setting. The Department of Education guidance, plus other existing statutes and regulations, are essentially establishing our duty of care during this global pandemic as we prepare for reopening. That becomes our legal set of obligations that we do need to make sure we live up to. There are significant legal issues that will arise if we do not show due diligence, if we do not take all of the reasonable steps we need to follow these guidelines. And we want to do everything possible to keep everyone safe and not have a breach of that duty of care. So we need to establish that our actions that we're taking are reasonable, and that we have effective, consistent enforcement of new protocols, which will be a large challenge in and of itself, making sure that from school to school, from classroom to classroom, from teacher to teacher and student to student, we have a consistent way that we are implementing all of this. So let's think big picture. The restart committee that has to be in place in each of our schools You should be appointing that committee now if you have not done so. That committee needs to start its work immediately. We know that it has to have school level and district level administrators. It needs to have Board of Education members. Very important, it does need to have the presidents or their designees from all of your local bargaining units. So you want to make sure, and it's critical, we're going to talk about this throughout our presentation, it's critical that we have all stakeholders have a voice in this process. And obviously our local bargaining units are critical stakeholders, as are students and parents and others. We need to have content experts, educators, parents. Ideally you have parents from each grade level. So if you have elementary, middle, and high school, ideally you'd have parents from all those levels. Students should be part of this. And we do want to think about issues of diversity as you're appointing your committee. So you want to have individuals who have responsibility for students with disabilities, for English language learners, and the person serving on the committee itself, we want to think about racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity. Because there are issues of equity, very serious issues of equity that come up as we're thinking about reopening. So we want to make sure that we're sensitive to that as we're forming this restart committee. So the committee will play a central role in your process, the restart committee. It's going to be recommended needed policy revisions that your board will need to adopt. It will ensure ongoing clear communication, which is a critical part of this process. We're asking people to dramatically change their behavior, everyone involved in our schools, and we need clear ongoing communication. The committee is going to have to think about contingency plans. Let's face it, we don't know what the future holds. There is real potential that at some point in time we may be moving back into a full closure. It is very possible. And we need to plan for that, and all sorts of other contingencies between being open and full closure that we need to be ready for. In order to do this well, and to make sure that we're making informed decisions, we can't work in a vacuum. So you can't just have this committee together talking with each other. We need to collect input from all of the key stakeholders. We need ongoing feedback. So input from parents, students, staff. There are so many foreseeable issues that we have to work through. And without that input, we will miss major considerations. And of course, no matter how great our plans are, some things are going to need to be revised as we go. We are building the airplane as we're flying, and we know there are going to have to be some revisions. So we need that restart committee to be nimble and open to that. As you're working through this process, there are some guiding questions that we want to keep in mind. These are not our guiding questions. This comes right from the New Jersey Department of Education guidance document. But in any new protocol you're thinking through, you want to make sure you ask these questions. Is this change in our policy or practice going to encourage social distancing? Will it discourage student cohort mixing to the greatest extent possible in areas like lunch periods, recess, assemblies? To the extent that we can keep students in smaller groups, it does reduce risk. Now that's easier said than done, certainly at the high school level, and even at the middle school level. But it's an important principle we want to think about, trying to limit the exposure to a large group of other students. Is the change going to encourage and improve hygiene practices? Hand washing and hand sanitizing have to become sort of instinctive. It is a huge part of this process, along with face coverings, and we're going to need to do everything we can to encourage those hygiene practices. How will all of this impact mental health and wellness? And that has to be a huge consideration for everybody, students, staff, the school community, parents. These are issues that require us to make sure we have a safety net and that there is no stigma attached to asking for help related to mental health. So you have that district-wide steering committee. Every school has to put in place, and again, we should be appointing these now if you haven't done so yet. We need to have a pandemic response team in each individual school. Now, if your schools have existing crisis response teams that have responded to other sorts of crisis situations, that can be your pandemic response team, but it does need to include all these folks. So you're going to have your school principal, obviously. We're going to identify a liaison to the district for that team. We're going to have teachers, we're going to have a child study team member, school counselor, mental health expert, the school nurse. The mention of the school nurse does remind me, Wayne, this, you pointed this out to me. With the restart committee at the district level, it's really critical that we involve the school physician. Do you want to comment on that for a moment?
Well, again, as physicians who work in the community, we are probably best suited to know what's going on outside of the school building, and working with schools, we can bring that useful information into the pandemic response team to better enable them to make decisions that will affect the children.
So that's an important voice, and it is not a required part of the team, but every team should involve your school physician. At least every restart committee, and to the extent the school physician can get involved in the school level pandemic response teams, that's wonderful. You need that voice to the greatest extent possible. We have to make sure we don't miss other key players like the custodians. They have a huge role in this process. Cleaning and disinfecting is just a paramount part of what we're talking about here. And we have to make sure we can actually do what needs to be done. So you need that voice in this process. School safety and climate obviously is a huge part of this. We're going to have major school climate challenges if we don't think through those issues. So make sure that all of these players are part of your process. We have to, as we begin this process, think about the world of options that are available. And it's a smaller world than we had in the past. But there are various options for us to think about. While we're thinking about those options, we know we have to meet the 180-day instructional requirement. We're going to talk about some areas where we have some flexibility in how we meet that requirement, but we have to meet it. Could be fully in person, but really that's not going to happen at this point anywhere in the state. That's unrealistic. So at this point, we are effectively looking at various hybrid approaches. There are various ways to do this, right? You could have some students come to school on Monday and the other half of students come to school on Tuesday and go back and forth on a daily basis. You could go on a weekly basis with a group of students and a different group the following week. There's all sorts of permutations on that. So don't feel like it has to be every other day. There's lots of different ways we can think about this. We also, and a lot of folks didn't realize this before the guidance came out, but we have the right to prioritize some students who need more in-person instruction. So we know that some of our students have struggled incredibly during this period of remote instruction through no fault of our own or anyone. It's just a very, very difficult way to provide instruction for some of our kids. And we do have the ability to think through, do some of our students, some percentage of our kids need to actually be in every day? And we should work through that process of potentially prioritizing that some students will be with us. On the other hand, we could have some students who are still completely on remote instruction, and the Commissioner of Education made that clear in announcing this plan. You might have some parents who are fearful, who still just are not ready to allow their child to return to in-person instruction, and we cannot penalize that student if we run into that situation. We're going to have to be ready to provide fully remote instruction at this point in time for some percentage of kids. And it's important for us as we're gathering data to think about that issue. So we can rethink instructional time though. We know the school day consists of no less than 4 hours for grades 1 through 12, no less than 2.5 hours for kindergarten. This is an important quote right out of the Department of Education guidance. Hours of instructional time are not defined as a student's time in front of a teacher or in front of a screen, but time engaged in standards-based learning under the guidance and direction of a teacher. So parsing that does mean that we do have some ability to think creatively about meeting this requirement for instructional time, and we can count guided activities that occur sometimes off hours. during evening hours, where students have certain guided activities being provided to them by a teacher that they are doing at other times. And it is not synchronous with all of the other students, potentially. We also can consider the use of some other personnel to help in this process. And this comes right out of the guidance, again, pages 57 and 58 of the road back, about how we can think about engaging our educational services personnel, counselors, social workers, psychologists, others, paraprofessionals to some extent, student teachers to some extent, to assist, not to lead, but to assist with virtual instruction. Because that one teacher can't be in all places at all times, right? So we're going to have some situations where the teacher is engaging with one portion of a class who is there physically, and we do have to think creatively about how we're supporting other students while that is occurring. And there's a range of options there, but we wanted to make sure you understood that sometimes other personnel besides classroom teacher can assist in that process. And as we begin this planning, we have to make sure that health and safety protocols are at the forefront of our thinking. So the anticipated minimum standards, the requirement is that we're going to have to follow the CDC guidelines for schools, including guidelines for cleaning and disinfecting, which are significant, the hygiene requirements, face coverings, social distancing, and we'll walk through these in some detail. But we have to get comfortable with these guidance documents. The Department of Health certainly has the ability to, as they choose, to raise the bar and to think about additional requirements that we might have to meet. As we're thinking about this, we always have to think about protecting and supporting students and staff who are at higher risk. So I'll have in a moment Dr. Yankus walk through that issue, because we do have to identify and provide reasonable accommodations for those at higher risk, whether they are students or staff members. So Dr. Yankus, why don't you talk about some of what we know about those who may be at higher risk for COVID?
Right. We have to consider that this is, again, a respiratory disease. It is not airborne. It is borne by respiratory droplets. The people at greatest risk are, in fact, older people, 65 and older, but you probably could say 55 and older, for fatal disease or disease with serious consequences. Children, on the other hand, are at the better end of the spectrum. But we have children, like adults, like faculty, that are medically fragile. The list here lists those things that are the conditions we have identified with this new or novel coronavirus. We have to remember that some of these conditions, like diabetes, are lifelong, and some of these, like immunocompromise, can be for a period of time. But if it's in your history, chances are you're going to be at risk. We are probably going to find that there will be more children who have a Kawasaki or inflammatory disease of the heart, lungs, and kidneys that is linked to COVID, but that remains very small at this time. We are still mostly focused on what our kids can transmit the disease to adults, teachers, medically fragile faculty, and certainly those older parents and older grandparents who might live at home with them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yankus. As we are thinking about our planning, so we're always going to keep at the forefront of our thoughts those individuals who are at higher risk. We're also going to think about some basic capacity issues, right? We can't choose an option that we are unable to achieve. And that's going to be very difficult for all of us. But we have to think about the capacity to meet health and safety standards. So access to PPE, hand sanitizer, if we're going to be using, in some cases, partitions, we have to do those calculations now, do those assessments now on the level of all of those sorts of things we're going to be providing. Potential staffing shortages, surveying our staff and students, and we'll talk about that in more detail, is critical. We have to go into this with our eyes wide open. In some districts, we are talking about those who are eligible to retire deciding to do so, perhaps in higher numbers, those who are medically fragile or have underlying medical conditions, not being able to come into work. We might have in some districts 20, 25, 30% staffing shortages. And we need to know that now. We have to gather that information. The cleaning and sanitizing demands, doing those calculations now. You know how large your facilities are, but the level of cleaning you've done in the past is apples and oranges compared to what we're going to be doing going forward. So we need to do those calculations on what it will take to do that level of sanitizing. And of course, educational effectiveness. I wish I could say that was our #1 and only consideration, but it has to be balanced with all of these other issues. While we're doing that, we have to also consider the needs of our at-risk students. As we said, those students who are going to need additional support, who we really are going to decide we have to prioritize and maybe in every day or for a larger number of days. We have to, while we're planning, also focus on issues of equity, access to technology, addressing some of those issues. And this report does give some strategies for trying to close the digital divide. Does give some information about resources that are available for school districts and for families to help with those issues. And of course, as we said, we have to think about the needs of our staff and some of the risk factors that some staff members may have. Engaging with our staff, we cannot compel staff members to share their medical information, but we can talk with our staff, let them know and make sure they are educated about areas where there is greater risk. And for those who are willing to share, we can work with those staff members on reasonable accommodations. So gathering data now is critical. There is no time to lose. We need to be putting together surveys and sending them out very, very quickly. We should be surveying our staff. We should be surveying parents. In some cases, you might decide directly to survey kids as well. We want to identify those staff and students who have underlying medical conditions now, so that we have a better sense on those who will be coming back, those who can't come back. We also want to learn about student experiences during this period of remote instruction. Some kids thrived and have done incredibly well. We want to know that. And how can we build on that experience when they come back? Others struggled incredibly, either with physical issues or mental health issues, or had a family loss that they're still struggling with. So we need that information in order to be prepared to serve these kids when school starts. We want to use data to plan for the students who might remain on virtual instruction or might need additional support, and for our staff members who may need reasonable accommodations, or knowing to the extent we can, those who might make that decision not to return. So we also have to lay the groundwork for what school will look like going forward. We have to level set expectations, right? We're talking about something that will look very different from what we had prior to March of this year. So we need to send out information early and often, not just once, and assume that everybody's going to study our new protocols. We have to send out information early and often on health and safety protocols for students, staff, parents, and other visitors. So for example, many districts are looking to create some basic videos. All right, this is our new hygiene practices. This is when we're going to ask your child to be either using hand sanitizer or washing their hands. This is what we're going to ask your child to do when they are entering the building, because it's a whole different protocol for doing that appropriately and safely. These are the questions we're going to ask when we're screening. People need to see this information now and become comfortable with it and ask their questions now, and not have all of these issues being dealt with on the very first day of school. We also have to set expectations for some things that are unfortunate, but are probably going to be a reality. It's unlikely that we're going to see field trips, right? It's unlikely that we're going to have the full range of extracurricular activities that we've had until now. There will be some. They'll be different. In many cases, it might be that activities that can be done virtually will be done virtually. So we've got to level set that expectation. We also do have to think about revising our code of student conduct. We're going to provide all sorts of support. We're going to make sure everybody understands the new protocols and procedures. And then we're going to have some people who willfully disobey them and potentially put them in danger. And I hope it doesn't happen in your particular district, but it probably will. So we need to think about our code of student conduct and what that will look like moving forward. And we have to communicate about the hybrid schedules that we're looking at, the changing attendance rules. And again, you may be able to have some students or many of your students who are engaging directly at the same time during virtual instruction, but not all of your kids. Some other kids might be doing their work at other times. What will grading policies look like? What other areas do we have flexibility and where don't we have flexibility? So this is going to take a great deal of communication up front. Some thoughts on surveys that you would want to send out. Surveys on student experiences related to academic engagement, their academic performance, their emotional well-being, behavioral issues that could have come up, potential COVID-19 related losses. So those are some of the things you'd want to ask about. We also want to ask parents about their views regarding their child's return to school or continuing with remote instruction. What we're hearing from some districts is that 20 to 30% of parents may not want their kids coming back to in-person instruction. You need to know what that looks like in your community. We need to know parental views regarding student transportation. It's going to be incredibly challenging. And frankly, we need to know if some percentage of kids are going to now be transported to school by their parents, making that choice because they don't feel comfortable having their child on a bus. And that information is critical to your planning. And we have to know parents' willingness or ability to respond on a daily basis. When we talk about screening and kids coming in, we're going to need information every single day, either directly from the student or from their parent. And that will be a challenge if parents aren't responsive. So we have to try to gather that information as well. Training for all stakeholders. We're going to be doing training on hygiene protocols, hand washing, sanitizing throughout the day. We should be planning training on cleaning and disinfecting protocols, which is nothing like what we have done in the past. Training on things like controlling the flow of traffic in a building. It's very likely that you're going to decide that students are only walking in one direction down various hallways. That will take planning, that will take training to have people not constantly passing each other in the hallway. Training on the idea that it's essential that if you're feeling any of the symptoms that we will talk about, that you not come to school, whether you're a student, a staff member, a parent, another visitor, that nobody decides to sort of tough it out and come to school when you're experiencing certain symptoms. So we thought in helping you to begin your planning process, we would try to break this down, sort of the flow of the day. Think about how do we get kids to school? What happens once they arrive? How do we deal with things like traffic flow, classrooms, some of the challenging issues like recess or physical education or athletics, dismissal. So we are in the process, and we are going to be providing, as we mentioned, future webinars. We are in the process here at NJPSA and FEA and Legal One of finalizing sample checklists that we will make available that help you do a deep dive in all of these different areas, and quick summaries of all of the mandates and recommendations in the Department of Education guidance. So we will be providing some additional resources to support you. But to begin that process, let's dive into some of these issues. Transportation. So all students who are able to must wear a face covering if we're not able to maintain social distancing on buses, or if we're not able to put physical barriers between rows on buses. So maintaining social distancing on buses will be incredibly difficult, right? That is an option, but it's going to be a hard option for districts. A 54 student bus would go down to 11 students in order for us to actually maintain social distancing standards. Or if you could afford to put in place physical barriers and you wanted to do that, there's lots of issues besides being able to afford it. You wanted to make sure it's safe as well. But potentially you could double that to 22 students on a bus. Even there, that's a significant cut in your capacity. We know that some students will be unable to wear a face covering. And then we need to provide other accommodations, which could be a barrier, could be for those particular kids that we are keeping them 6 feet away from other students. Some students who have certain disabilities, certain health conditions, just may not be able to wear a face covering. So we need to also think about adopting best practices for cleaning and disinfecting buses pretty much between every route. And that's a high bar. So these are some of the challenges. How to address problem behavior at the bus stop. You might say, boy, we've got enough to do. We can't control what kids do at the bus stop. And that's true. You can't directly control it. But once you have information, you have it, right? So if a bus driver is pulling up to a stop and sees a group of 5 or 6 kids all sort of playing around, ignoring social distancing, not wearing a mask, you now have knowledge as a school district, because that bus driver has knowledge that those kids are endangering themselves and others. So what do we do as far as our due diligence? Notice in advance to everybody about the importance of following all of our health guidelines while you're waiting for a bus to come. So notice to parents and students in advance. And then ongoing communication between the bus driver, and if we do have other folks on that bus, like an aide, ongoing and very timely, quick communication with school administration when we see kids who are not following the rules at the bus stop. So again, you can't completely control it, but you can play a role when you become aware of dangerous practices that kids are engaging in. Enforcing social distancing, hand sanitizing, and enforcing the wearing of face masks where appropriate. If we are not able to socially distance, and many districts will not be able to afford that, so we are going to have kids who are not socially distanced because of capacity issues, then we need to enforce the wearing of that face covering. And that has to be taken very seriously by the bus driver and potentially by another adult who's on that bus. So we have to put in place protocols so that we take that very seriously and enforce it. If there's no screening at this point, and some districts are talking about screening kids even before they get on the bus, and we'll talk about screening protocols in a moment, we do have to be aware that there is a potential exposure issue to other students and any staff members who are on that bus. So it's at least worth talking about, is this a point where we potentially do some screening? So there could be significant expenses, and we need to understand that and be ready for that. There are those heightened standards for cleaning and sanitizing that have to be met. There's some options that we should think about now as we're trying to come up with how do we do all of this, right? You have the ability for those parents who are willing to accept it to provide payment to a parent, a per pupil amount in lieu of providing transportation. And that can help you with capacity issues, providing those payments. You have the ability, although politically I know this is not easy, but about a third of the busing we do in the state of New Jersey is courtesy busing that we're not mandated to provide. But again, I recognize there are lots of other reasons we're providing it, oftentimes because of health and safety concerns with the routes that kids would have to walk. So you want to engage with your community on that issue, but at least it's something you need to be considering. And identifying parents who choose to transport their own child. That summer survey is critical. You might find it's a significant percentage. You might find 10, 20% of your parents where kids would have otherwise gotten on the bus, the parent will be transporting that child, and that will help you with your planning. So asking those questions is critical. When it comes to entering the school, we know that districts must adopt a screening policy for students and employees and everyone coming into that building. So one option is to confirm with the parent or guardian on a daily basis, and I have to stress daily basis, that the student is free of symptoms. You could do that electronically, but my concern is that we need a seamless system, right? Let's say you say, well, we can set up this electronic system and 80% of your parents respond, but 20% don't. And the staff persons who are manning the various entrances don't know which are which, right? So kids could easily fall through the cracks if we don't test out our systems in advance and make sure they will work and we will get the information we need if we're going to try to do this electronically on a daily basis. We do need to adopt procedures for any symptomatic staff and students, and Dr. Yankas will help us walk through that in a moment. And while it's not explicit in the guidance, it's just common sense. We're going to apply the same screening protocols that we have for students and staff to parents and other visitors as well. So that should be clear that these protocols apply across the board. And by the way, they apply whether someone is politically connected or not. The virus doesn't care whether you are a locally elected official about any danger that it might cause. So the student screening process will create backlogs of students entering the building, right? So you want to consider how you're going to handle that backlog issue. You're going to have to make sure you are monitoring the kids who are outside waiting to get in. Make sure that they're still wearing their face covering, or where possible, that they're still socially distancing. And that will take additional staff supervising kids. We need to think about, frankly, some broader criteria for inclement weather. Last thing you want is 100 kids waiting to get into a building, you know, having to do it very slowly, and you've got huge thunderstorms, or you've got horribly cold weather when we get into the later months and into the winter, and potentially kids who are in danger because of how long they're waiting outside in very difficult weather. So we might have broader criteria for when we decide we're going to switch to remote instruction for that day. You want to consider staggering your start time schedule to try to reduce the backlog. Not easy to do when you have, you know, multiple kids from the same family and the parents just want to drop them all off at the same time. But you want to have at least those discussions about staggering those times to the extent possible so that you don't have everybody coming all at once. And that plan to monitor students while waiting in line is critical. If we do not do that monitoring, it is foreseeable that lots of kids won't follow the rules, or others who are waiting in line. And that will cause additional harm, and that will create liability for school districts. We also want to think, though, about, you know, having more entrances for all sorts of good reasons. We have limited the number of entrances in order to ensure security protocols are followed. We can't lose those security protocols, but we should talk about how do we keep in place security while providing more entrances. And in some of your schools that will be possible, and some it won't. But you should be looking at that issue. Dr. Yankas, do you want to talk about some of these symptoms that we know are areas for concern?
Right, and this relates somewhat to the screening process as well. Clearly, a fever of 100 degrees or greater, the CDC will say 100.4. Somebody who's visibly coughing, short of breath, somebody who basically looks pale, sick, ill. This is a list of the COVID-19 symptoms. You can't see all of them, you can some. And obviously they are the criteria. What we're going to be up against at the start of the school year is not only COVID, there will be the usual fall illnesses. The good news has been there have been very few summer illnesses that will carry over because most kids have not been to camp, the pools are closed, and we've not been outside of the house much. So at the beginning of the school year, any one of these that is on the slide right now that the school nurse or the person doing the screening is aware of, obviously is essentially a non-entry criteria.
Absolutely. So one of the challenges is, of course, there could be another perfectly reasonable explanation for some of these symptoms. So for example, 2 kids ran to school because they're worried about being late. Well, that's why they're short of breath, right? Because they just ran a half mile to get there on time. So there is this little, that's right, coughs and allergies. And so you can document the student has certain allergies. So there is this phrase in the guidance that says, if not otherwise explained. So you want to think about your criteria for what's a reasonable explanation, right? It can't just be that the student says, oh no, I get this all the time. But there can be reasonable explanations. There could be documentation that somebody has certain allergies and you are going to see a certain reaction. Muscle pain. Student is on the track team and just ran 10 miles the day before, and that's why they're sore. So you certainly can have reasonable explanations, but you have to think that process through as well so that there are some standards attached to it. Additional screening questions. So during the screening process, you're going to want to gather information on the prior screen that we just showed you. But you also might want to think about this. Somebody is returning from another state or country where the CDC is saying you should self-quarantine. Well, if the CDC is saying you should self-quarantine, that really means that the student shouldn't be coming to school. You know, when we see this with folks coming from certain states where the recommendation is that you should quarantine for 14 days. So we're going to have to gather that information. We certainly might be telling certain families, you've just come back from this particular location, you need to self-quarantine, and your child's going to be on remote instruction for this period of time. Or another common sense question would be, have you been in close contact with someone else, you know, maybe someone in your family who is COVID-19 positive, or who is presumptively positive, has gotten a test and is awaiting test results? That's another reason that you might screen someone and say you're going to have to be on remote instruction and not come into the school environment. So I would think about that and a broader set of questions for your screening. Dr. Yankas, I'd love you to comment on this. Right? If you read the guidance literally, it does say that you could simply do a visual screening, which suggests no questions, and that somehow we would be able to tell anybody who was symptomatic just by looking. Is that a credible process?
Screening is going to be the nightmare of everybody. I mean, clearly, we screen people to prevent sick people from coming into the flow of well people. We screen people so that for their benefit or ours, they can go home and recover. Now, according to the guidelines, and we have several different takes on the guidelines between our 104-page document, the CDC document, and then over the weekend, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out its own document, all of which address screening. Temperatures, of course, are the most likely to uncover a sick person. If you have a temperature of 100 or 100.4 greater, that is largely going to be what we put forward as the best screen. Now, everybody will argue people have higher temperatures, people have lower temperatures. I ran to school, I wore a bandana, it was my hat, it was my ski mask, whatever. There are ways to deal with that. My recommendation to superintendents and principals is don't have your nurse do the temperatures, because if someone's positive, she or he is going to have to isolate that student until they can get picked up, or they are going to be the ones who will know the kids that are medically fragile, who may or may not qualify for the screening process as everybody else does. What we have to deal with screening and visual screening, what the document says is if you don't do temperatures, you have to screen visually to look to see who is sick. Now that does require a level of medical expertise, which in a one nurse, one school building essentially puts one employee in the position medically and legally of having to look at every kid and faculty member walking in and determine whether or not that rash is hives, winter skin, or is that really the sign of an illness? Visual screening is going to be very difficult. Asking parents to take temperatures is not something I would consider, but it is in the document to have a parent take a temperature either in front of you, which now brings a crowd, or to tell you what the temperature was, which invites misinformation. We also have to keep in mind the New Jersey Interscholastic Sports Authority has mandated temperature taking for teams. So you are going to have employees doing temperatures as screening for athletes, whereas this document gives us the opportunity to not use a thermometer to screen. Do we have the capacity to deal with all of those who show symptoms? We are now asking in the document for nurses to have essentially areas where these students can be masked and safely monitored and waiting pickup. So at the beginning of the school day with screening, as one of the documents said, you have to be nimble. And that is, you have to do what is feasible and practical. And I think this is going to be organic and dynamic and change with time. But we have to be prepared for the fact that a lot of parents will not be available to pick up students who are symptomatic, and grandparents that might have done that won't want to.
That's right. It's a great point. So we are going to have to be prepared for some kids who will still be there all day with symptoms. And needing to-
Isolated with a mask on in a separate room, yes.
Absolutely. Unrelated issue, and again, probably none of the folks on this call, when they decided to go into education, thought they were going into contact tracing. And you're not directly, but school people are going to be part of this process. So school districts must work with the local Department of Health after learning of a positive COVID-19 test. And you're not entitled to that information. But once you get that information, and you will, some of you, you have to work with your local Department of Health. You need to develop a contact tracing policy in consultation with your local Department of Health, with your school nurses and your school physician. And there is this option, just to point out, for your school safety specialist to have free access to a Johns Hopkins 3-hour contact tracing course and receive credit towards their school safety training requirement. So these are some of the challenges, and Dr. Yankas, I'll ask you to weigh in on this as well. Here's one: some local departments of health have limited capacity, right? So you're relying on them to take the lead on contact tracing, and they've got a tiny staff, and there are huge delays, and those delays are potentially endangering lots of folks because we're not doing the contact tracing we need to. So working with your local Department of Health, you may need to be very persistent. Schools need to share student schedule and contact information for those teachers and students who were in close contact with an individual who has tested positive. So close contact is defined as somebody within 6 feet for 10 minutes or more. Now, again, there's some situations where you're obviously not going to know for sure. Well, were they within 6 feet for 5 minutes or 10 minutes? We're not sure. So you're going to err on the side of giving more information rather than less, if you have some people who might fit that criteria. And we're going to have to figure out the relevant window of time, right? If somebody was tested and they didn't get the results for 4 days, we have to figure out who they were in close contact with over those 4 days when they were in school, not just 1 day, because it's a much broader window. So the school also needs to inquire if any staff are aware of other students or staff who may have been in close contact. So for example, a student confided to his counselor that he was dating somebody else. That counselor knows that the student was in close contact with the person that they're dating. And the district knows it because the counselor knows it. The school administration needs to ask staff those questions or we won't get those answers. And the failure to collect that information does create foreseeable risk of harm for other exposed individuals. So it is critical that we act prudently and quickly to get this information. Any other thoughts on contact tracing, Dr.
Yeah,
Yankas?
one of the things we need to keep in mind is contact tracing is not new. It's been around a long time. Whenever we have an outbreak of meningitis at school, or we have an outbreak, God forbid, of measles, an outbreak is simply defined as having more than the number of cases one would expect. A perfect example is if you have 4 or 5 cases of whooping cough in the 4th or 5th grade, you now have an outbreak. So the contact tracing is not only for mitigation, but it's also for protection of everybody else in that class and the faculty. Once we are now dealing with a new virus and we don't know how it will behave, we've only had 3 months of knowing how it will behave, contact tracing, being in touch with people who were in contact with that very sick person, will enable us better to mitigate and control. Remember, isolation is what happens to the sick person. Quarantine is what happens to the person who isn't sick, that we don't want to get sick. But if they do get sick, we don't want them to suddenly be the next person causing isolation. So contact tracing is not new. It's very effective. But it's the first time we've really asked more than our school nurse to contact the local Department of Health regarding what's happened at school. Usually we simply report a case of measles, we report a case of chickenpox or something that was in school, and that's the end of it. But now there's going to be much more of an interaction because of a pandemic or cases that have now gone beyond the walls of the school, the state, and the country.
So just to build on some of the challenges that we need to think about and plan for, the CDC cleaning protocols do indicate that if we have somebody who has tested positive and they were in the school, that we should be closing off every area of that school building where that person was. Ideally, although this won't always be possible, but ideally after first waiting 24 hours before we actually do a cleaning. So you have a student who walked through most of that school building, you know, over that day or over a couple of days if they were waiting for a result. Effectively, you may be forced to close down that school building for a period of time if you have a positive result for a student, a staff member, or a visitor. So we need to be prepared for that, right? And we certainly can have individual cases popping up anywhere. And that's going to be a challenge for us to potentially be moving in and out of remote instruction. So everyone needs to understand that is a possibility. Let me pause here for a moment, and I am going to say that we are going to go over today for those who are able to stay with us. But let me pause for questions, Rebecca.
Yes. First of all, thank you all for your questions. There is no way we can handle all of them, but we certainly did try to put them in groups. One of the questions that they're asking quite often is about, will the union contracts have to be negotiated again based on some things that we are asking our staff to do now? That's a staff kind of question.
Let me deal with that one. We do have to think about what is a change in terms and conditions of employment, right? So if you are, for example, this is an obvious one, you're asking somebody in order to do their job, they have to work an extra hour a day in order to get all this stuff done. That's absolutely a change in terms and conditions of employment and would have to be negotiated. You're asking somebody who has never been involved in cleaning to take on that role. That's a change in terms and conditions of employment that would have to be addressed. So it does depend on exactly what we're asking folks to do. In some areas, you know, it's a new protocol, but it would not be a change, I don't think, in terms and conditions of employment. So somebody monitors the hallway as a duty, and we're asking them to continue to monitor the hallway as a duty and to make sure everybody follows the new rules, the new code of conduct. Even though the rules are very different, that would not, in my view, be a change in terms and conditions of employment to do that. You also could have an issue arise if we're not providing proper PPE and we're asking someone to do something and endanger that person while they're doing it, right? So we know that some folks will need a higher level of PPE, our custodians, a paraprofessional who is working one-on-one with a student and needs to be in significant contact with that student, a school nurse. So you certainly could have some issues arise there if we're not providing the appropriate level of protection for those folks.
Okay, we had another question regarding the students that are sent to school with symptoms or are sick and the parents don't come to pick them up right away. We're going to be running out of space in the nurse's office. Can you just talk about the school's requirement on that one?
Yeah, it's we know this is going to happen. So we're going to have to identify additional areas in that building that could be used for what I would call overflow. You just have too many kids to have in the nurse's office who are waiting for a parent to come and pick them up. So we're going to have to identify those additional areas. And that's much easier said than done. And let's face it, you might have a parent who is unable to get there at all or who doesn't come for several hours. So this is going to be, I think, an ongoing issue for pretty much every district to work through, but you have a legal obligation to do it.
David, 2 points on that. One is obviously when you isolate a kid who's sick to go home, or you've determined through screening the child should not have been there, you will need monitoring in that room, particularly
Yes.
for the younger kids, and actually, quite frankly, for the older kids. The second point of that is we are encouraging our school nurses to update their emergency contact cards in the summer before the school year so that there's more than one person that can pick up the child. In other words, if you put down a grandparent, we found that a lot of those grandparents moved to Sun City, Arizona, and they're not available. You know, you need to list people. If you can't pick up your child, who else do you give permission to pick up your child so that they don't languish there all day? Because the nurses aren't running clinics.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, we're going to see this issue and we're going to have to be very persistent with parents. And that's why educating parents now is critical on this. They might think that you're overreacting. My child just has the sniffles. Why are you making me, you know, drive an hour to get back to school and pick my child up? You don't have an option. And you need to make sure parents will understand that you don't have that option. You can't ignore symptoms that you become aware of in any child. So I do want to briefly touch on some of the other issues we have, and I don't think we're going to be able to walk through everything in our PowerPoint, but I want to touch on a couple of other key points. Classrooms. The guidance does say that we need to provide social distancing to the maximum extent practicable, and that's going to be very challenging. If we wanted to ensure social distancing, you'd have to have a 6-foot radius around that child. So that requires 113 net square feet. And that would be if we were sort of strategically placing all the seats. If you have kids in direct rows, sort of one right in back of another, it's going to be more likely something like 144 net square feet that we would need per child in order to make that work and actually ensure a 6-foot distance in every direction. If we're unable to socially distance, which will be true in many cases, you could do barriers between desks. Again, there's a significant expense to that as well. Or the guidance does say you can have students all facing in one direction, right? And if we have that as the option that we're using, and we don't have students sort of around a desk or a table looking at each other, facing in one direction, you do need to require face covering during class. And it also does talk about limiting the sharing of items or cleaning between uses. So if you were using some sort of a manipulative during the class, making sure that we're cleaning that, and you're sharing any sort of an item that, you know, we don't get to the next group without cleaning that item first. So lots of challenges here in the classroom. There's a requirement for hand washing or at a minimum, the use of a hand sanitizer for 20 seconds. Whenever a student blows his or her nose, coughs, or sneezes, this will be a major enforcement issue because you're going to have staff who just don't want to do this. We have to have this happen, at least the use of the hand sanitizer, every time a student blows their nose, coughs, sneezes. Students are likely to test these rules, right? They're likely to turn around and face each other, not socially distance, maybe purposely cough or blow their nose. We know this. So we're going to have to make sure that staff are enforcing these rules, taking them very seriously. Younger students should not be using a hand sanitizer without being supervised by an adult. It could be dangerous. So we shouldn't be doing that. And there's the significant and ongoing cleaning and sanitizing requirements. So Dr. Yankus, I know this is a huge burden, but the hand washing and sanitizing is really an important part of our health protocols, isn't it?
It is the single most important way to reduce the number of sick kids in school and or faculty. And it is true for almost any disease. It is going to be difficult to enforce just because of the way our schools are built. And we also know that exactly as you said, they're going to be enforcing this is going to be difficult, particularly for students who will act out because they are simply children.
Yeah. As difficult as it will be, we have to show due diligence in expecting every teacher to follow these rules and work to have students follow these rules. Let me touch on a couple of other issues. Meals, you know, the days of any sort of a self-serve or buffet or family style for now are over. We really need to be moving towards pre-packaged bags or boxes, even better, for lunches. We should think about delivering the lunches to the kids as opposed to having them get in line. Consider whether we do provide lunch in classrooms instead of in the cafeteria. Because in the cafeteria, obviously, we can't have kids wearing a face covering while they're eating. So we would have to follow the social distancing rules or have barriers between kids, which doesn't seem feasible. So you might seriously want to consider lunch in the classroom. No sharing of food. We need to think about, if we are going to be in a cafeteria, staggering times and allowing enough time for cleaning between lunch periods, and hand washing, or at least the use of hand sanitizer before and after meals. That's all built into this guidance. And while we're implementing that guidance, we do have other statutes that we have to keep in mind. We can't shame students who are unable to afford to pay for their lunch, or stigmatize them in any way, or give them something different than we're giving to other students. If we run into an issue where a family that could afford it is not paying for their meals, there are other procedures, but we're not denying students meals. Recess and physical education also create huge logistical and health challenges. So at the elementary level, recess is required. It hasn't gone away. K through 12, physical education is required. Now, many districts are thinking about tailoring their physical education so they do the health component at the start of the year, as opposed to the physical education component, which will help, lengthen the time before we have some of these challenges. You want to establish cohorts so kids aren't mixing together in very large groups, create boundaries between groups. The guidance says always wash hands, not wash hands or use hand sanitizer. It says always wash hands immediately after outdoor activities. So planning that creates another set of challenges, because you don't want 100 kids all cramming into the restroom right after recess, right? So controlling how kids go out and come back from recess. Staggering the use of playground equipment, because we're gonna have to clean that equipment. And I would consider closing off access to locker rooms. It is not going to be available for summer student athletes. I would think about closing that off period for physical education as well. So some challenges: monitoring that students actually stay in a cohort and don't go run off and play with somebody else, enforcing social distancing and wearing masks, the cleaning and disinfecting, and enforcing hand washing without creating those new issues. There is some flexibility that you might want to think about. Students can satisfy, remember, at the high school level, your graduation requirements through the use of option 2, as it's called, and we give you the citation for that. So you might have some students who can complete outside alternative activities that would satisfy the physical education requirement. You could complete the physical education requirement through guided virtual activities as part of a hybrid approach. Perhaps that part of your program is always happening virtually because of some of the challenges with physical education happening in person. So you want to think about those options. And you want to think about all of this for those of you who are deciding to go forward with athletics this summer. The phase 1 standards that NJSIAA laid out, we have to follow starting July 13th. So it's coming up very quickly. There are certain preconditions that have to be met before somebody's allowed to participate in athletics. There's a COVID-19 questionnaire that needs to be completed 7 days prior to the start of the first workout. Medical clearance for those who were positive or have underlying medical conditions. Dr. Yankus, I know you and I have talked about this. We both have, very serious concerns about some of the potential issues that could arise with athletics.
Yeah, and again, because the NJSA put out a set of guidelines that are often more than what we're doing at school, and in some cases less than, it really is an additional burden on schools over the summer. Remembering that an awful lot of our employees are 10 months. That's true of school doctors and nurses in general. And a lot of people who should be around to offer advice and counsel are not.
That's right. So here's just some of the challenges. But right, we didn't have any athletics in the spring. All of a sudden, we're asking people to do some pretty intense things. So we should be rethinking, what summer workouts look like. Folks who are going to be unfamiliar with pre-screening protocols and might not follow them, making sure that workouts are no contact in this first phase. Eventually, it seems like there will be contact, but not right now between July 13th and 26th. Face coverings, except when somebody is directly involved in high intensity aerobic activity. So not in the middle of wind sprints. Once you catch your breath, before and after, you put the face covering back on. Small cohorts, no more than 10, no access to the locker room, and all those extensive hygiene and cleaning requirements. And these are some other related issues that you should be aware of. So every district has to have emergency action plans for responding to serious or life-threatening sports-related injuries. Those plans had to be amended now to also deal with any serious health issues related to COVID-19. So that needs to be in your plan. And we have to make sure we're following the NJSIAA heat participation policy. We could have very dangerous conditions that happen when folks are engaged in workouts in July and August. So let me pause there. We won't walk through the rest of the slides. I will let you know that we have some slides for you that talk about equity issues to be aware of when it comes to COVID-19, being prepared while we're opening school and dealing with this pandemic, to also be prepared to discuss issues of racial justice and potentially be prepared for things like student protests, and in thinking through how to engage with students to do that safely and still have their voice be heard. And we have a lot of information included here on human resource protocols and entitlements that staff members have to various leave options related to COVID-19. So we have all that information in the PowerPoint, but I did want to leave a little bit more time for questions from folks.
Okay, we have questions on the quarantine and vacations. If staff members are coming back from quarantined areas at the end of the summer at our vacation times, and they have to self-quarantine, who pays for those days? Is that part of the emergency, or do they take sick days?
So staff member comes from another state or country, they need to self-quarantine. And now you've got a question about whether, one question would be, are there assignments we can give to that staff member virtually, right? So if you could do some sort of a reasonable accommodation and provide assignments for that person, then you don't have to use sick days at all for that period of time. I don't have the answer to this question. I think this is going to be a problem legally, because if a staff member is knowingly going somewhere where they know they're going to need to self-quarantine, I think that creates a real problem for the staff member who has put himself or herself into a position where now they can't work and they might be required to use their sick leave when they've made that knowing decision, as opposed to you went somewhere and all of a sudden while you were gone, the rules changed and now you have to self-quarantine where that wasn't expected.
Thank you, Dave. Also, one more quickie on safety drills, how this will affect the safety drills. We spoke about this.
Yep. So safety drills have not gone away. And, we are in an ongoing dialogue with the Department of Education on some of the real challenges that come with this. So you're going to have to think through the safety drills that you will do now and try to put off where you can some types of drills. But you have certain mandatory drills that we have to do at the start of the year. You're still going to have to do them. Where you can, you're going to socially distance, but we have a drill that you're doing, a shelter-in-place drill, where you're asked to go into a class and go into one corner of that room, and it's impossible to socially distance. That's the sort of issue that we are we need to engage with the New Jersey Department of Education. There is the potential that you're going to have to move forward with those drills, and during that drill, you're not going to be able to socially distance. You are going to still require face coverings. You are going to do what you can to limit the actual physical contact. You are still going to have to pay attention to other rules with sneezing and coughing and some of those issues. So we're working through that with districts, but you're not going to be excused from the drill requirement at this time. We don't see any evidence that that will happen.
And one more quick, to all of you who came late and to all of you who were asking, I answered where I could. You will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint with the audio. If your audio did not work during it, the copy you get will have the full audio, and we will be getting that out to you within 24 hours. And I will add a personal note. Your questions are amazing, and you're right on track with what we should be asking. There's a lot of things that we're going to have to work out, but I had so many questions, Dave, Dr. Yankas, and the questions are the right questions that are being asked. We're right on the money with knowing what to ask, and that's important too.
Absolutely. And at this stage of the process, we recognize we don't yet have all the answers. Part of our goal today was to help you begin the planning process, make sure you're asking the right questions, you're putting in place the right structures, you're thinking about some of the foreseeable challenges that are going to come up. For those who are interested, we are doing a deep dive into these issues next week, July 8th and 9th, a 2-day Pandemic Response Institute that NJPSA FEA is doing in partnership with the New Jersey Association of School Administrators. And we are, in addition to that, going to be offering some additional free webinars over the summer, and in particular over the next over this month of July, to help all of you as you're planning for reopening. So we recognize this has to be an ongoing dialogue. Today was just the start of supporting you as you plan for reopening. And we do hope that this information was helpful for everybody. Dr. Yankas, let me thank you again. You've just been an incredible resource for us every step of the way as we're trying to work through all these issues.
Thank you. I'm certainly happy to help.
And Rebecca, as always, thank you for being such a great support as we're thinking through all these issues as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for everything you're doing for our kids. Please know that we are here for you, and look for information coming soon on additional free webinars to help you with this planning process. And again, I would encourage you to think about also investing in this 2-day institute that we have coming up next week. So thanks, everybody. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.